The scratching sound of the red wax crayon against the imported Carrara marble floor was the only rhythm in the subterranean room. Scratch, drag, tap. The smell of the lavender wax mixed violently with the heavy, pungent odor of Dante's Cuban cigar and the sharp, clinical scent of ozone pumped through the high-end HVAC system. I stood motionless near the heavy steel inspection table, my tailored charcoal suit absorbing the absolute chill of the underground vault room. The ambient temperature was locked at exactly 62 degrees. My breathing was a slow, deliberate intake of air through the nose, expanding my lower ribs just enough to feel the cold, hard press of the customized heckler, Koch USP concealed in my shoulder holster. Dante Falcone paced the perimeter of the room. His heavy leather shoes squeaked microscopically against the polished stone. He was sweating. A thin, glistening sheen of moisture coated his forehead, despite the chilled air. He took a violent drag from the cigar, the cherry burning a harsh, angry red in the dim light, before blowing a thick cloud of blue smoke toward the reinforced concrete ceiling. The fabric of his bespoke suit pulled tight across his shoulders, betraying the rigid, coiled tension of a man entirely consumed by the pressure of a ticking clock. Mikhail Rostova stood perfectly still on the opposite side of the room. The massive Russian wore a heavy sable overcoat that smelled faintly of diesel fuel and expensive cologne. Two of his Spetsnaz-trained enforcers flanked him, their hands resting casually near their waistbands, their pale eyes scanning the dead angles of the concrete bunker. Mikhail did not smoke, he did not pace. He simply watched the small, fragile figure sitting cross-legged on the marble floor. Leo was 5 years old. He wore a pristine white button-down shirt, buttoned all the way to the collar, and dark wool trousers. He paid absolutely no attention to the 4 heavily armed men looming over him in the buried depths of the Chicago financial district. His entire universe was restricted to the red crayon in his tiny, pale hand and the massive sheet of drafting paper spread out before him. The Mosler vault door dominated the far wall. It was a 3-foot-thick slab of brushed titanium and reinforced steel, an architectural monolith designed to withstand a direct kinetic strike. Behind that door lay $50 million in untraceable bearer bonds and high-clarity uncut diamonds. The liquidation of the Falcone family's legitimate assets gathered over 6 months of bloody internal purges, ready to be handed over to Mikhail's network for international laundering. But the Mosler vault was a ghost trap. My former boss, Leo's father, had designed it with a level of paranoia that bordered on clinical insanity. It utilized a dynamic algorithmic sequence. The 16-digit access code did not just change every 24 hours. It evolved based on a highly complex mathematical seed. There was no physical master key. There was no digital override. There was only the algorithm. And the only place that algorithm existed was inside the rapidly developing, mathematically savant brain of the 5-year-old boy currently drawing geometric shapes on the floor. "The timeline is fracturing, Dante," Mikhail said. His voice was a low, guttural rumble that vibrated through the floorboards. "My cargo ships leave the port in exactly 2 hours. If the bonds are not secured in the maritime containers by midnight, the transit window closes. I do not delay international logistics for a child's coloring session." Dante stopped pacing. He pulled the cigar from his mouth, his jaw muscles feathering rapidly. He glared at the Russian, the veins in his thick neck straining against his silk collar. "You get your money when the vault opens, Mikhail. The boy needs to calculate the sequence. You rush him, he drops a digit. He drops a digit. The Mosler internal security protocol incinerates the contents with a thermite charge. We all walk away with ashes." I watched Dante's left hand. It was trembling, a microscopic vibration in the fingertips. Dante was a street boss, a man who understood the blunt force trauma of a baseball bat in a dark alley. He did not understand high-end cryptography. He did not understand the quiet, sterile tension of a subterranean bank transfer. He was entirely dependent on a child who barely spoke 3 words a day. I shifted my gaze to Leo. The boy's hand moved with erratic, brilliant speed. He wasn't drawing pictures. He was writing numbers, columns and rows of integers, prime variables, and fractal equations spilling across the white paper in red wax. He hummed a low, tuneless melody, entirely detached from the lethal atmosphere suffocating the adults around him. The smell of the cigar smoke grew thicker, almost nauseating in the confined space. "Leo," I said. My voice was a flat, even frequency, carefully modulated to avoid any aggressive spikes. I stepped forward, my leather soles making zero sound on the marble. I crouched down, bringing my eye level down to his. Leo did not look up. The red crayon snapped against the paper, leaving a heavy wax deposit on the number 7. "We need the final sequence, Leo. The 16 numbers." The boy stopped humming. He set the red crayon down with deliberate, agonizing precision, aligning it perfectly parallel to the edge of the drafting paper. He picked up a blue crayon. He did not look at me. He stared blankly at the brushed steel surface of the massive vault door. His lips parted slightly. The breath hitched in his small chest. He wrote a single line of 16 digits across the bottom of the paper in blue wax. I did not wait for Dante to give the order. I stood up, memorizing the sequence in a fraction of a second. 4, 9, 2, 7, 8, 1, 5, 5, 3, 0, 9, 4, 6, 2, 1, 8. I walked directly to the heavy digital keypad mounted flush against the concrete wall next to the vault. The keypad was cold, the stainless steel keys worn smooth. I inputted the numbers. My fingers moved with mechanical efficiency. I did not look at the keys. I looked at the dark, polished surface of the Mosler door, watching the distorted reflections of Dante and Mikhail behind me. The final 8 was pressed. A profound, heavy silence fell over the room. The air conditioning seemed to stall. Deep within the 3-foot-thick steel door, a heavy mechanical clunk reverberated. It sounded like a bank vault door closing, but it was the sound of the massive titanium locking bolts retracting. The pneumatic seals hissed, a long, drawn-out exhalation of compressed air that smelled of ancient dust and machine oil. The massive steel wheel in the center of the door began to turn on its own, driven by the internal motorized hydraulics. Dante dropped his cigar on the marble floor. He didn't bother to crush it. He stepped forward, his eyes wide, a hungry, desperate gleam illuminating his face. Mikhail's enforcers supidely shifted their weight forward, their postures aggressive, preparing for the physical transfer of the $50 million in untraceable wealth. The heavy door groaned, swinging outward on its massive, lubricated hinges. It moved with glacial slowness, revealing the absolute darkness of the inner vault. The automatic overhead halogen lights inside the vault flickered and snapped on, casting a harsh, blinding white glare over the interior. I stood exactly 2 feet from the threshold. I did not step inside. The vault was 20 feet deep and 10 feet wide. The walls were lined with customized stainless steel shelving units, designed to hold standard-issue secure transport briefcases. The shelves were completely empty. There were no bearer bonds. There were no diamond certificates. There was no $50 million. The air in my lungs turned to solid ice. The chill of the underground room suddenly pierced through the wool of my suit, settling directly into my marrow. I did not move my head. I did not blink. I systematically scanned the empty steel shelves, processing the visual data against the flawless architecture of the reality I thought I knew. The vault was not just empty, it was pristine. There was no dust. There were no scuff marks on the steel from heavy briefcases being dragged. The room had been sterile for a long time. In the exact dead center of the polished concrete floor inside the vault, illuminated by the harsh halogen light, rested a single object. It was a child's wooden building block, the letter A painted in faded, chipped yellow paint. The silence behind me shattered. "Where is it?" Dante's voice was a ragged, high-pitched bark that tore through the sterile air. He lunged past me, his heavy frame crossing the threshold of the vault. He spun around, his eyes wild, frantically searching the empty steel shelves, as if the $50 million could somehow hide behind the metal brackets. "Where is the money? Dominic, where is the goddamn money?" Mikhail Rostova did not shout. The massive Russian simply raised his right hand, a micro-movement. Both of his Spetsnaz enforcers drew their suppressed weapons in absolute unison. The metallic clacks of the slides racking echoed violently in the enclosed space. The black muzzles leveled directly at Dante's chest and my head. "A very dangerous theatrical performance, Dante," Mikhail rumbled. His voice possessed the dark, crushing weight of a collapsing building. The smell of his diesel and cologne suddenly felt suffocating. "You bring me to a subterranean tomb. You use a child to open an empty box. You think the Russian networks are easily insulted?" I did not raise my hands. I kept my arms relaxed at my sides, my right hand hovering exactly 3 inches from the grip of the HK under my jacket. I shifted my gaze from the barrel of the gun pointed at my face to the wooden block resting on the vault floor. "The sequence was correct," I said. My voice was a flat, dead calm that stood in stark contrast to Dante's escalating panic. If the sequence was forced or incorrect, the thermite charge would have engaged. The air in this vault is cold. No thermite burned here. The vault was opened legally. "Nobody has the sequence," Dante screamed, spit flying from his lips. He clawed at his own hair, his bespoke suit suddenly looking disheveled, the illusion of the boss entirely stripped away. "Only the boy knows the math. Only Leo, and he has been locked in the penthouse under 24-hour armed guard for 6 weeks." I looked back at Leo. The 5-year-old boy had not reacted to the drawn weapons. He had not reacted to Dante's screaming. He was sitting on the floor, holding the blue crayon, staring blankly at the massive steel door. The scent of lavender wax drifted up from the drafting paper. I looked at the paper. Beneath the 16-digit sequence written in blue, Leo had begun to draw something else. Small, precise geometric lines. "Mikhail," I said, keeping my eyes locked on the Russian boss, "if this was a trap to execute you, you would be dead before the vault door opened. If this was a scheme to steal your time, we would not have brought the boy. Someone emptied this vault before tonight. Someone who bypassed the algorithm without triggering the internal security." "Impossible," Dante gasped, leaning heavily against the empty steel shelves. His breathing was rapid, shallow, bordering on hyperventilation. The sensors, the weight metrics. "Any unauthorized entry triggers the alarms in my office." "Then the entry was authorized," Mikhail stated, his pale eyes narrowing. He did not lower his hand. The guns remained pointed at us. I stepped slowly backward, moving away from the fatal funnel of the vault entrance. I moved toward Leo. The boy was still drawing. I looked down at the drafting paper. The lines he was drawing were not abstract geometry. He was drawing the exact architectural schematic of the ventilation shafts running parallel to the vault room. He was drawing the intake valves, the exhaust fans, and right next to the exhaust fan schematic, written in perfectly formed, jagged red numbers, was a timestamp, Ba, Hong AM. 3 hours ago, the air pressure in the room suddenly felt incredibly heavy. The false trail was already weaving itself around my throat. We had walked into a secured facility, relying on a mathematical genius who couldn't tie his own shoes, completely blind to the fact that the vault had been compromised while we were sleeping. I looked at the wooden block in the center of the vault, the letter A. It wasn't a random piece of garbage. It was a signature, a deliberate, mocking taunt left by a ghost who knew exactly how the Falcone family operated. Dante stumbled out of the vault. He reached under his jacket, his hand wrapping around the grip of his heavy revolver. The guards. The internal security detail. Someone sold us out. "Do not draw that weapon, Dante," Mikhail commanded. The metallic click of the Russian enforcers disengaging their safeties was incredibly loud. The tension in the subterranean room reached a critical mass. $50 million vanished into thin air. A Russian syndicate ready to paint the walls with our blood. A terrified, incompetent boss clutching a gun he didn't know how to use. And in the center of the absolute chaos, a 5-year-old boy who quietly picked up a green crayon, entirely unfazed by the weapons, the screaming, or the missing fortune, and began to draw a perfect, meticulously detailed picture of a bleeding eye. The heavy metallic clacks of the Spetsnaz safeties, disengaging, echoed against the brushed titanium of the Mosler vault. The sound hung in the sterile, chilled air, a brutal counterpoint to the soft, rhythmic scraping of the green crayon in Leo's hand. The 5-year-old was shading the pupil of the bleeding eye on his drafting paper. Scratch, drag, tap. Dante's hand, slick with nervous sweat, gripped the handle of his Smith Wesson revolver hidden beneath his tailored jacket. His knuckles were bone white. His chest heaved, pulling oxygen into lungs that suddenly felt entirely inadequate for the subterranean pressure. I did not move toward Dante. I did not move toward the Russians. I stepped precisely into the intersecting geometry of their firing lines. I placed my body directly between the suppressed muzzle of the lead Russian enforcer and Dante's chest. The air displaced by my movement carried the sharp scent of ozone and the heavy, sour stench of Dante's panic. If he draws that weapon, Mikhail, your men will put 3 subsonic rounds through his thoracic cavity before the barrel clears his holster, I said. My voice remained completely flat, an acoustic dead zone in the escalating chaos. Dante will fall backward. His finger will contract post-mortem. The revolver will discharge into the concrete ceiling. The acoustic shock wave will shatter the boy's eardrums. A deaf savant cannot process the auditory feedback of the algorithm. We all lose. Mikhail Rostova stared at me. His pale blue eyes were chips of glacial ice floating in a sea of raw, unadulterated violence. The heavy scent of diesel fuel and expensive cologne radiating from his sable coat seemed to thicken, pressing against my face. "The vault is empty, Dominic," Mikhail rumbled. The syllables ground together like tectonic plates. "The Falcone family has insulted my network. In my country, an empty box is a declaration of war." "It is an empty box," I agreed, my eyes locked on his. "But it is an empty box sitting in a sealed subterranean bunker with a single elevator shaft and a biometric security grid. $50 million in untraceable bearer bonds and uncut diamonds weighs approximately 180 pounds. It requires 2 heavy transit bags. It requires a forklift to move it past the loading dock upstairs. Your spotters have been watching the perimeter of this building since yesterday afternoon. Did they see 2 heavy transit bags leave the loading dock?" Mikhail's jaw tightened. The microscopic shift in the heavy muscles of his neck indicated the gears of logic engaging over the primal instinct to slaughter. His spotters were elite. If 180 pounds of high-value cargo had moved through the perimeter, he would have known. "No," Mikhail stated. "Then the money is still inside the building," I said. I turned my back on the drawn weapons of the Spetsnaz enforcers. It was a calculated exposure, a physical demonstration of absolute certainty. I walked slowly over the polished marble floor, stepping past Dante, who was hyperventilating, his hand still frozen under his jacket. I crossed the threshold into the sterile, blinding white interior of the Mosler vault. The temperature dropped another 5 degrees inside the steel box. I approached the dead center of the concrete floor. I crouched down, the fabric of my trousers pulling tight against my knees, the wooden building block. I did not touch it immediately. I lowered my face to within 3 inches of the chipped yellow paint. The letter A was faded, worn down by the friction of a child's hands. I inhaled slowly through my nose. The vault smelled of oxidized steel and dry, recirculated air, but clinging to the wooden block was a faint, secondary odor. It was distinct. A sharp chemical tang mixed with the heavy, sweet scent of aged cedar. Cyanoacrylate. Industrial superglue. And the faint, metallic ghost of burned magnesium. I pulled a pristine white silk handkerchief from my breast pocket. I wrapped it around my hand and picked up the block. The wood was cold. I turned it over. On the underside, barely visible against the grain of the cedar, was a tiny, microscopic scorch mark, a pinprick of blackened carbon. I stood up, holding the silk-wrapped block. I walked out of the vault, bypassing Dante, and went directly to where Leo was sitting on the floor. The boy had finished the bleeding eye. He was now drawing a series of complex, interlocking gears. The green crayon moved with frantic, jerky precision. I looked at the timestamp he had written next to the ventilation schematic. Bar, Hong AM. I turned my head, scanning the northern wall of the subterranean room. The architecture of the bunker was designed by Leo's father, Aldo Falcone. Aldo was a paranoid visionary who trusted concrete more than human flesh. The bunker was entirely airtight, relying on a massive industrial HVAC system to circulate oxygen. High up on the northern wall, near the reinforced ceiling, was a heavy steel intake grate. It measured 3 feet by 3 feet, secured by 4 massive industrial hex bolts. I walked toward the wall. I stood directly beneath the grate. The chilled air blew downward, ruffling the hair on the back of my neck. I looked up. The top left hex bolt was stripped. The heavy steel edge of the bolt head gleamed with the bright, harsh reflection of freshly sheared metal, a stark contrast to the dull, matte finish of the other 3 bolts. "Someone bypassed the intake manifold," I said, projecting my voice across the room so Mikhail and Dante could hear. "They used a microthermal lance to burn through the internal locking pins. That explains the trace of burned magnesium on the block." Dante stumbled forward, his heavy shoes scraping the marble. He looked up at the grate, his face a mask of sweating, desperate confusion. "The intake shaft is 20 inches wide. It runs straight up to the street-level exhaust vents. It's lined with laser tripwires and pressure sensors. A rat couldn't crawl down that shaft without triggering a full lockdown on my phone. Unless the sensors were looped to the thousand programs," I replied, tracing the trajectory of the shaft in my mind. "A static digital loop masking the breach. And a 20-inch shaft is too narrow for a grown man." I looked down at Leo, the 5-year-old boy. "But it is not too narrow for a child," Mikhail's voice echoed behind me. The heavy, crushing weight of the false trail began to solidify, weaving a narrative that perfectly explained the impossible geometry of the heist. The algorithm only existed in Leo's brain, but Leo was entirely non-verbal. He did not speak the numbers, he wrote them. If someone had access to the boy in the dead of night, they could force him to write the sequence. I turned to face Dante. "Where were you at 3 o'clock this morning, Dante?" I asked. The question was a scalpel, designed to cut through the panic and hit the bone. Dante flinched. The sweat on his forehead caught the halogen light of the open vault. He looked at Mikhail, then back to me. His eyes darted toward the heavy steel door of the elevator shaft. "I was in the penthouse," Dante stammered. His voice lacked the deep resonance of a boss. It was the high, thin sound of prey. "I was doing the final security sweeps. I was coordinating the transit routes for the convoy. The boy's room is adjacent to your office in the penthouse," I noted, taking a slow step toward him. "You had a 4-man security detail stationed outside his door. Who was the shift captain last night?" Dante's jaw worked frantically. The color drained from his face, leaving a sickly, pale gray hue. "Vargas. Thomas Vargas. He took the graveyard shift." "Call him," I commanded. Dante reached into his jacket with a trembling hand, pulling out a heavy encrypted smartphone. He tapped the screen. The speakerphone engaged. The sterile room filled with the electronic ringing tone. Ring, ring, A sharp, mechanical click. "This number is currently out of service. Please check the number and try again." The automated voice echoed off the titanium vault door. Dante stared at the phone. The device slipped from his sweaty fingers, clattering onto the marble floor. He backed away, his hands flying to his head. "Vargas?" Dante gasped, his breathing turning into ragged, wet hyperventilation. He knew the blind spots. He knew the camera rotations. He has the boy's trust. The logic was flawless. A perfect, closed-loop narrative of internal betrayal. Vargas, the trusted shift captain, leverages his access to the Savant child in the middle of the night. He uses the boy to generate the algorithm. He drops a small, agile thief, perhaps a professional contortionist, or a starved tunnel rat down the 20-inch intake shaft to bypass the biometric doors. The thief opens the vault from the inside using the code Vargas procured, loads the bearer bonds and diamonds into a heavy duffel bag, and uses the internal winch system of the HVAC unit to haul the 180 pounds of wealth straight up to the street level, bypassing the subterranean security perimeter entirely. Vargas cuts the feed, disables his phone, and vanishes into the Chicago underworld with $50 million, leaving Dante to face the wrath of the Russian syndicate. Mikhail took a heavy step forward. His sable coat swept the floor. He looked at the shattered phone, then at Dante. "Your house is not in order, Dante," Mikhail rumbled. The Spetsnaz enforcers lowered their weapons slightly, shifting their tactical focus from an immediate execution to a strategic extraction. The enemy was no longer standing in the room. The enemy was currently moving through the city with their money. "You have a rat, a very wealthy rat. I'll find him," Dante spat, a sudden, desperate surge of adrenaline masking his terror. He pointed a trembling finger at the elevator doors. "I will tear the city apart. I will peel the skin off his bones while he breathes. I have men on the streets. We lock down the airports, the train stations. He can't move that much bulk without a logistics network." Mikhail ignored him. The Russian boss turned his massive head toward me. He recognized the true architecture of the Falcone family. He knew Dante was the loud, incompetent face, while I was the silent, calculating spine. "The transit window closes in 2 hours, Dominic," Mikhail said, the absolute cold of the Russian winter settling into his tone. "I do not care about your internal politics. I do not care about your shift captain. I care about my cargo ships. You have 120 minutes to recover the assets and deliver them to Pier Bourne, or I will order my network to systematically dismantle every legitimate holding the Falcone family possesses. I will burn your empire to the ground, brick by brick." Mikhail did not wait for a response. He turned on his heel. The heavy sable coat flared. The two Spetsnaz enforcers fell into step behind him, walking backward toward the elevator, their eyes never leaving my hands. Mikhail pressed the call button. The heavy steel doors slid open. The 3 Russians stepped inside. The doors closed, leaving a heavy, suffocating silence in their wake. Dante collapsed against the steel inspection table. He buried his face in his hands, letting out a long, ragged groan that sounded like a dying engine. "He's gone," Dante mumbled, his voice muffled by his hands. "Vargas took it all. The Russians are going to slaughter us. We're dead, Dom. We are walking ghosts." I did not look at Dante. I looked down at the silk handkerchief in my hand. I peeled the white fabric back, exposing the wooden building block. The letter A, faded yellow paint, the scent of cedar and cyanoacrylate. The false trail was a masterpiece of logical deduction. It relied on Occam's razor. The simplest explanation is usually the correct one. Vargas had access. Vargas had the motive. Vargas had disappeared. But the architecture of the underworld is rarely built on simple explanations. It is built on misdirection. I walked over to where Leo was sitting. The boy had finished his drawing. He had placed all his crayons in a perfect, color-coordinated row, parallel to the edge of the drafting paper. He sat perfectly still, staring at the blank concrete wall. "Leo," I whispered, kneeling beside him. The boy did not react. I placed the wooden block on the floor, exactly 3 inches from his right knee. Leo's eyes snapped downward. His small, pale hand reached out with striking speed. He grabbed the block. He did not inspect it. He did not look at the faded letter A. He flipped the block over, staring intently at the microscopic scorch mark on the bottom. His breathing hitched. The rhythmic, shallow intake of air stalled in his chest. His fingers began to tremble. A violent, rapid vibration that shook his entire arm. He dropped the block. He covered his ears with his hands and began to rock back and forth, a low, continuous moan escaping his lips. It was a severe sensory overload response. A catastrophic psychological trigger. I stood up, the block forgotten on the floor. The cold air of the subterranean room finally reached my core, freezing the blood in my veins. Leo was a savant. His brain processed mathematics and geometry with flawless precision, but his emotional bandwidth was severely stunted. He did not form attachments to toys. He did not care about wooden blocks. He only cared about the patterns they formed. 6 months ago, Aldo Falcone, the true boss of the family and Leo's father, was killed in a massive car bomb on the Lower Wacker Drive. The blast was so intense the forensic teams had to identify Aldo by the dental records fused to the steering column. Dante assumed the throne the next morning. Aldo was a paranoid man. He did not trust digital encryption. He built the Mosler vault. He designed the algorithmic sequence. And Aldo was the one who taught Leo how to process the algorithm. Aldo used to sit on the floor of the penthouse with Leo for hours, playing with a set of antique wooden building blocks. I had watched them. Aldo would arrange the blocks in complex, shifting patterns, teaching the boy how to derive the prime variables from the spatial geometry of the letters. The letter A was not a signature from a random thief named Vargas. The letter A was the primary seed integer for the entire cryptographic sequence. I turned my head, staring at the heavy steel elevator doors. Vargas did not steal $50 million. Vargas did not know how to drop a contortionist down a 20-inch ventilation shaft. Vargas was a blunt instrument, a street enforcer promoted to shift captain because he was too stupid to ask questions. The thief didn't need to force Leo to write the code at 3 in the morning. The thief already knew the code, because the thief was the one who invented the algorithm. The tectonic plates of my reality violently shifted, grinding against each other with a deafening, psychological noise. The narrative of the dead brother, the closed casket funeral, the sudden, seamless transition of power to Dante. "Dante," I said. My voice was a flat, dead frequency that sliced through the sound of Leo's low, continuous moaning. Dante lifted his head from his hands. His face was a wet, grey mask of absolute defeat. "We need to mobilize the street crews, Dom. We need to find Vargas before the Russians." "Vargas is dead," I stated. Dante froze. The frantic, nervous energy evaporated, replaced by a sudden, rigid stillness. "What? How do you know?" "Because Vargas was a loose end," I said, taking a slow, measured step toward the heavy steel inspection table. I kept my hands loose at my sides, adjusting my spatial awareness, calculating the distance between my right hand and the grip of the HK. A man who orchestrates a $50 million subterranean heist without triggering a single biometric sensor does not leave his shift captain alive to be interrogated. Vargas is rotting in the trunk of a crushed car in a junkyard. "Then who?" Dante demanded, his voice cracking, the panic threatening to shatter his fragile composure again. "Who has the money?" I did not answer him directly. I looked down at the red and blue wax stains on the marble floor. "Aldo built the ventilation shafts, Dante," I said, tracking his micro-expressions. "Aldo designed the pressure sensors. Aldo knew the blind spots in the thermal cameras because he installed them. He built the perfect fortress. And he built the perfect backdoor." Dante's eyes widened. A flash of pure, unadulterated terror pierced through the grey mask of his face. He took a step backward, his hand hovering over the bulge of the revolver under his jacket. "Aldo is dead," Dante whispered, the words trembling violently on his lips. "I saw the car. I saw the ashes." The coroner signed the papers. "The coroner works for the Falcone family," I countered, closing the distance to 6 feet. "The coroner signs the papers you pay him to sign." The dental records were a match because someone planted the dental records in the wreckage before the fire department arrived. The silence in the room became an oppressive physical weight. The air conditioning hummed its relentless, industrial note. Dante's breathing grew incredibly shallow. The heavy, sour scent of his sweat was replaced by the sharp, acidic tang of primal fear. He stared at me, his jaw working frantically, trying to form a lie that his body was already betraying. He didn't need to speak. The truth was written in the microscopic twitch of his right eye, the sudden, rigid locking of his shoulder blades. Dante did not orchestrate the heist tonight to steal the money from the Russians. Dante orchestrated the car bomb 6 months ago to steal the throne from his brother. But Dante was incompetent. He failed to realize that a man as paranoid as Aldo Falcone would never step into a vehicle without sweeping it for explosives. Aldo found the bomb. Aldo realized his own brother was trying to butcher him, so Aldo let the car burn. He faked his own death, vanishing into the shadows of the Chicago underworld, leaving Dante to inherit a throne built on a foundation of sand. Aldo waited in the dark for 6 months, watching his incompetent brother liquidate the family's legitimate assets, gathering all the wealth into one single, physical location: the Mosler Vault. Aldo waited for the exact moment the money was converted into untraceable bearer bonds and diamonds. He bypassed his own security systems, slid down the ventilation shaft, used the algorithm he had created, and emptied the vault. He didn't just steal $50 million. He set Dante up to take the fall. He engineered a scenario where Dante would owe an unpayable debt to the Russian syndicate. Mikhail Rostova would do the dirty work, executing Dante and dismantling his loyalists, while Aldo walked away with the wealth, entirely untouched. It was a masterpiece of underworld architecture, a flawless, mathematical equation of vengeance, and I was standing in the middle of the blast radius. "He's alive," Dante choked out, the reality finally crushing the last vestige of his denial. His knees buckled slightly. He gripped the edge of the steel table to keep from collapsing onto the marble floor. "Aldo is alive. He took the money. He's going to let the Russians slaughter us." "Yes," I said. Dante's eyes darted frantically around the room, settling on the heavy steel elevator doors. The primal instinct of a cornered animal took over. The logic evaporated. "We run," Dante gasped, pushing off the table. He drew the heavy Smith Wesson revolver from his holster. His hand was shaking so violently the barrel rattled. "We leave the boy. We take the service stairs. We get to the ghost cars in the lower garage. We disappear before Mikhail's spotters realize we missed the transit window." I stood perfectly still. The cold steel of the hatch K rested heavily against my ribs. I looked at Dante, the acting boss of the Falcone family, a man who murdered his own brother for power, only to be outsmarted and led to the slaughterhouse by the ghost he created. He was weak. He was panicked. He was a liability. I looked at Leo. The 5-year-old boy was still rocking back and forth on the floor, his hands clamped over his ears, trapped in a sensory nightmare, entirely oblivious to the lethal calculations being made around him. The architecture of survival in the underworld does not allow for panic. It does not allow for flight. Running from the Russian syndicate is a slow, exhausting suicide. Mikhail's reach extended across continents. There were no ghost cars fast enough to outrun his logistics network. The only way to survive a falling building is to stand in the doorway. "Put the gun down, Dante," I said. My voice was a soft, dangerous whisper that barely carried over Leo's moaning. Dante spun toward me, the heavy revolver jerking wildly in his trembling grip. The barrel pointed erratically in my general direction. His eyes were completely unhinged, the pupils dilated to the edge of his irises. "Are you deaf, Dom?" Dante screamed, spit flying onto the pristine collar of his bespoke shirt. "Aldo set us up. The Russians are going to peel our skin off. We have to move. If you walk out of those elevator doors, the Spetsnaz spotters will put a high-velocity round through your skull before you reach the ghost cars," I stated, keeping my eyes locked on his trembling trigger finger. Mikhail did not leave the perimeter unsecured. He locked us in. "We have 115 minutes to deliver $50 million to Pierbourne." "We don't have the money," Dante shrieked, the revolver waving dangerously close to my chest. "Aldo took it." I took a slow, deliberate breath, drawing the chilled, ozone-scented air deep into my lungs. The adrenaline spiked, a cold, dark fire flooding my nervous system, sharpening the edges of my vision. The $50 million in the vault was gone, but the Falcone family's wealth was not entirely liquidated. Dante had spent the last 6 months paranoid, hoarding capital to solidify his illegitimate claim to the throne. He didn't trust the family accountants. He didn't trust the Cayman offshore routes. He trusted physical leverage. "You have a private safety deposit box at the Vanguard Trust on LaSalle Street," I said. The words hit Dante like a physical blow. He froze. The wild, frantic waving of the revolver stopped. He stared at me, his jaw hanging open, a mixture of profound shock and absolute terror washing over his sweating face. "How?" Dante stammered, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. Nobody knows about Vanguard. I set that up under a ghost corporation. I am the cleaner, Dante, I replied, my voice a flat, dead frequency. I clean up your messes. I erase your footprints. In order to erase them, I have to know where you step. You transferred the union kickbacks, the extortion capital from the Fulton market, and the skimming profits from the illegal casinos into that box over the last 20 weeks. Dante's breathing grew shallow again. He gripped the revolver tighter, the knuckles turning white. There is $60 million in uncut diamonds and bearer bonds sitting in Vanguard box Tam Tram Reborn, I stated, the mathematical precision of the calculation locking into place. It is enough to satisfy Mikhail's transit window. It is enough to buy our lives. No, Dante gasped, taking a step backward. He shook his head violently, a pathetic gesture of denial. That is my exit fund. That is my insurance policy. If I give that to the Russians, I have nothing. I am broke. The capos will smell the blood in the water and tear me apart. If you don't give it to the Russians, you won't have a head for the capos to tear apart. I countered, taking a single, measured step forward. We take the boy. We go to Vanguard. We extract the 60 million. We deliver it to Pierbourne. We survive tonight. We hunt Aldo tomorrow. Dante stared at me, the conflict tearing his mind apart. The greed battled the primal fear of death. He looked at the heavy steel elevator doors, imagining the Spetsnaz snipers waiting in the dark. He looked at the empty Mosler vault. He looked at the boy rocking on the floor. He slowly lowered the heavy Smith Wesson revolver. The barrel pointed toward the marble floor. Vanguard requires a dual biometric scan, Dante whispered, the defeat settling heavily into his shoulders. He looked like an old man, crushed by the weight of a crown he was never strong enough to wear. My retinal scan and a secondary thumbprint. I used Vargas's print. The logic of the underworld is a jagged, unforgiving blade. Vargas is dead, I reminded him. Then we can't open the box, Dante said, a hollow, bitter laugh escaping his lips. It's locked down. We are dead either way, Dom. I did not break eye contact. I did not flinch. Vanguard uses a dynamic cryptographic override protocol for emergency executive access, I said, my voice dropping to a chilling, absolute calm. A 16-digit algorithmic sequence. Dante frowned, his sluggish brain struggling to process the information. I don't have the sequence. The bank generates it dynamically. I slowly turned my head. I looked down at the 5-year-old boy sitting on the marble floor. Leo was no longer rocking. He was staring at the blank drafting paper. He picked up the blue crayon. Aldo Falcone did not just build the Mosler vault. Aldo Falcone was the architect of the entire Falcone family's digital infrastructure. He designed the security protocols for the subterranean bunker. He designed the encryption for the offshore accounts. And he designed the emergency executive access protocol for the Vanguard Trust. Leo did not just know the code for the empty vault. The boy's savant brain held the foundational mathematical seed for every single cryptographic lock the Falcone family possessed. The boy has the sequence, I stated. Dante stared at Leo. The realization dawned on his sweating face, a twisted mixture of horror and salvation. He raised the heavy revolver, aiming it not at me, but at the child sitting on the floor. The heavy, ventilated barrel of the Smith Wesson Magnum wavered. The front sight post, a serrated ramp of blued steel, vibrated violently as Dante's entire central nervous system buckled under the crushing weight of his own terror. He was aiming the hand cannon directly at the small, pristine white collar of the 5-year-old boy sitting on the floor. The hammer was already cocked. 3.5 pounds of pressure separated the heavy firing pin from the magnum primer. Dante's index finger was slick with sweat, twitching erratically inside the trigger guard. He was an amateur pushed past the breaking point, operating purely on the erratic electrical impulses of a cornered rat. "Make him write the sequence, Dom," Dante hissed. His voice was no longer human. It was a high-pitched, wet vibration that sounded like tearing wet canvas. He kept his eyes locked on the boy, but the barrel drifted slightly to the left, then back to the right. Make him write the Vanguard code, or I swear to God I will empty this cylinder into him and we will both burn. The air conditioning unit pumped a fresh wave of 62-degree ozone into the subterranean bunker. It caught the heavy, cloying scent of the lavender wax crayon and pushed it across the room, mixing it with the sharp, acidic stench of Dante's fear sweat. I did not raise my hands in a placating gesture. I did not offer a soothing tone to de-escalate the psychological spike. De-escalation implies a mutual desire for a peaceful resolution. I had no such desire. The architecture of survival relies entirely on the conservation of momentum. When an opponent commits to a fatal trajectory, you do not block their path. You accelerate their momentum until they shatter against a wall they never saw coming. The boy requires a specific spatial prompt to access the Vanguard algorithmic seed, Dante, I said. My voice was a flat, baritone hum, meticulously calibrated to match the ambient noise of the ventilation system. I took a slow, deliberate step laterally to my right, widening my stance, separating myself from the immediate splatter zone. He needs the antique wooden blocks. Aldo kept them in the penthouse. We cannot generate the sequence with just a crayon. Dante's eyes darted toward me for a fraction of a second. The whites of his eyes were bloodshot, the capillaries bursting under the astronomical spike in his blood pressure. "You're lying," Dante spat, his grip on the magnum tightening. The knuckles turned a translucent white. He opened the Mosler vault. He has the numbers in his head. Make him bleed the numbers onto the paper. The Mosler sequence was seeded by the letter A, I replied, taking another microscopic slide to the right, adjusting the geometry of the room. My right hand rested casually against my ribs, hovering precisely 1 inch above the lapel of my tailored suit jacket. Vanguard uses a dynamic cryptographic hash. It requires a 12-block spatial configuration. You pull that trigger, the only thing you extract from his head is gray matter and bone fragments. You execute our only key. Dante's jaw trembled. The logic was an iron spike driven into his frantic brain. He wanted to reject it, but the absolute freezing certainty in my voice anchored him to the terrifying reality. He needed the boy alive. He needed the code. The heavy magnum dipped, just a fraction of an inch. A momentary lapse in his combat focus, as his mind desperately tried to calculate the logistics of retrieving the wooden blocks from the penthouse, while the Russian spotters surrounded the building. It was a window of exactly 0.4 seconds. My right hand did not reach for the gun. It simply collapsed inward, my thumb hooking the fabric of the jacket lapel, sweeping it aggressively backward to clear the Kydex holster. The heavy, customized heckler, Koch WSP, Bunwilam was already in my grip, drawn and leveled in a single, fluid arc of pure muscle memory. I did not aim for the center of mass. I did not aim for the head. A fatal shot to the central nervous system would cause an involuntary muscle contraction. His finger would pull the heavy magnum trigger in the spasms of death. I aimed for the fulcrum of his leverage. I pulled the trigger twice. The heavy tungsten suppressor attached to the hatch K muffled the explosive expansion of the propellant gases, converting the deafening roar of the Born Mui Lum caliber rounds into 2 sharp, mechanical coughs. Foot. PFT. The acoustic shockwave slapped against the brushed titanium of the empty Mosler vault. The first subsonic hollow point round struck the heavy steel cylinder of Dante's Smith Wesson. The kinetic energy transfer was violent and absolute. The massive impact ripped the weapon entirely out of his slick grip, sending it spinning wildly through the air. It clattered harshly against the far concrete wall, discharging a magnum round into the ceiling with a deafening, concussive boom that rained pulverized stone dust down upon us. The second round struck Dante precisely in the right radiocarpal joint. The hollow point slug hit the dense cluster of carpal bones at 800 feet per second. It did not simply break the wrist. It vaporized the structural integrity of the joint, expanding upon impact, shredding the tendons, the radial artery, and the ulnar nerve before exiting through the back of his forearm in a spray of dark crimson mist. Dante did not scream immediately. The human brain requires a fraction of a second to process catastrophic structural failure. He stood perfectly still, his eyes wide, staring at the ragged, bloody stump of his right hand. The arterial spray pulsed in time with his racing heart, painting the pristine Carrara marble floor in jagged, rhythmic red arcs. Then the shock receded, and the agony flooded the severed nerve endings. Dante dropped to his knees. A guttural, animalistic shriek tore from his throat, echoing violently in the subterranean chamber. He clamped his left hand over the ruined stump, desperately trying to stem the catastrophic blood loss, rocking back and forth on the marble. The smell of vaporized copper, burnt cordite, and fresh arterial blood instantly overpowered the scent of the lavender crayon. I did not lower the hatch key. I walked forward, my leather soles stepping carefully over the expanding pool of blood. I kicked the discarded Smith Wesson Magnum across the room, sliding it under the heavy steel inspection table. I stood towering over Dante. The acting boss of the Falcone family was weeping, a pathetic, blubbering mess of tailored silk and shattered bone. He looked up at me, his face twisted in a mask of absolute, uncomprehending horror. You shot me," Dante gasped, choking on his own saliva. The blood pumped rapidly through his fingers, pooling around the knees of his expensive trousers. "Dom. Why? I am the boss. I am the boss." I looked down at him. The cold, dark fire in my veins settled into a deep, freezing calm. The perspective I had meticulously maintained for 6 months, the facade of the loyal, calculating cleaner, finally fell away. "You were a placeholder, Dante," I said. My voice echoed off the concrete walls, stripping away the final layers of the illusion. "You were an incompetent, paranoid middle manager promoted far beyond the limits of your own intellect. You were a signature on a checkbook. Nothing more." Dante shook his head violently, spraying droplets of sweat and blood across the floor. Aldo is coming for us. You have to patch me up, Dom. We have to run. He took the 50 million. He has the Russians hunting us." I crouched down. I brought my face to within 2 feet of his sweating, graying features. The smell of his impending death was a heavy, metallic weight in the air. "Aldo is not coming for you, Dante," I whispered. The words were a scalpel, slicing precisely through the false narrative I had just spent 20 minutes constructing. Aldo is carbon. Aldo is dental records fused to a steering column. Aldo burned at 3,000 degrees on the Lower Wacker Drive 6 months ago. Dante froze. The rocking motion ceased. The agonizing pain in his shattered wrist was momentarily eclipsed by the absolute, mind-bending friction of my statement. He stared at me, his bloodshot eyes searching my face for a lie, a misdirection, any shred of the reality he thought he inhabited. He found only the endless, black void of the abyss. "You," Dante stammered, his lips trembling. "You told Mikhail. You showed me the intake shaft, the microthermal lance, the scorch mark on the block. I stripped the hex bolt on the intake grate with a heavy torque wrench 2 hours before you brought the Russians down here," I explained, the clinical detachment in my voice absolute. "I used a butane microtorch to scorch the underside of the wooden block. I placed it in the center of the vault after I emptied it." Dante's chest heaved. The blood loss was accelerating his cognitive decline, but the brutal, horrifying truth was finally penetrating the fog of his panic. "You," Dante breathed. The word was a wet, ragged exhalation of pure defeat. "You took the 50 million. "I took the 50 million, I confirmed, standing up, looking down at his pathetic, kneeling form. "I brought Leo down here on Tuesday night. I sedated Vargas with a heavy dose of liquid benzodiazepine in his coffee. He slept at his post. I walked the boy into the vault room. I handed him the red crayon. I procured the sequence. I opened the Mosler door, and I loaded 180 pounds of bearer bonds and uncut diamonds into 6 heavy-duty dry cleaning bags." "How?" Dante choked, a bubble of blood forming on his lips. "The perimeter. The spotters. The spotters look for tactical threats," I said. "They look for armored convoys. They look for heavy duffel bags. They do not look for the family cleaner carrying the boss's freshly pressed suits out to the dry cleaning van at 4 in the morning. The 50 million has been sitting in a climate-controlled storage unit in Cicero for 3 days. The architecture of the betrayal was finally laid bare. It was a masterpiece of misdirection, built on the predictable reactions of incompetent men. "Why?" Dante sobbed, the tears mixed with the sweat on his face. "If you had the 50 million, why didn't you just disappear? Why bring the Russians? Why let them put a gun to my head?" I looked at the heavy titanium door of the empty Mosler vault. "Because 50 million was the ceiling of your ambition, Dante," I stated, my eyes drifting back down to his bleeding form. "It was merely the foundation of mine. I knew you were skimming from the legitimate streams. I knew you were too paranoid to leave the stolen capital in the Cayman accounts. You were hoarding a shadow treasury." I stepped closer, the toe of my leather shoe resting an inch from the expanding pool of his blood. "But you are a coward, Dante. You would never voluntarily reveal the location of your exit fund. You would never hand over the keys to your survival. A man like you only reveals his hidden parachute when the plane is actively falling out of the sky." The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. The entire night, the empty vault, the Russian ultimatum, the meticulously constructed ghost story of his dead brother returning from the grave, it was all a psychological pressure cooker. Our vice eye had slowly tightened around his skull until the structural integrity of his secrets shattered. I manufactured a crisis with Mikhail Rostova to force Dante to open the Vanguard Trust. "You set me up to be slaughtered," Dante whispered. The fight was completely gone. He was a dead man waiting for his heart to stop. "You used the Russians to squeeze me. I used your own incompetence against you," I corrected. "You invited the wolves into the house because you thought you could buy their loyalty with a single payout. You fundamentally misunderstood the geometry of power. You thought you were the king. You were just the bank." I reached into the inner pocket of my suit jacket. I pulled out a small, sterile trauma dressing. I did not offer it to Dante. I kept my hand resting near the grip of the hatch key. "The physical key, Dante," I commanded. "Vanguard requires a physical key alongside the biometric override. Where is it?" Dante looked at his ruined right arm. The blood was pumping slower now, the dark red turning to a sickly, pale crimson as his body drained. He looked up at me. A final, pathetic spark of defiance flickered in his dying eyes. "Screw you, Dom," Dante spat, the blood flying from his lips. "If I am dead, you get nothing. The Russians will tear you apart when the transit window closes. You can't access the box without my eye, the retinal scan." I did not raise my voice. I did not issue a threat. I simply raised the HK and pointed the suppressor directly at his left kneecap. "The retinal scanner at Vanguard Trust operates on an optical recognition matrix that maps the capillary structure of the retina," I explained, my tone strictly informational. "It requires an intact, relatively fresh ocular globe. I do not need you breathing to use your eye, Dante. I just need the eye. I can remove it here with a scalpel and carry it in a saline solution to LaSalle Street. It will remain viable for approximately 4 hours post-mortem." I lowered the barrel of the gun slightly. "Or you can give me the physical key, and I will put a round through your brain stem. You will not feel a thing. The choice is a matter of anatomical preference. Do you want to die screaming while I carve the eye from your skull, or do you want the lights to go out instantly?" Dante stared at the black hole of the suppressor. The defiance evaporated, crushed by the absolute, clinical certainty of my violent intent. He knew I was not bluffing. He knew I possessed the anatomical knowledge to execute the extraction without hesitation. He swallowed a mouthful of blood. He slowly, agonizingly, reached his intact left hand toward his own throat. His fingers fumbled beneath the collar of his bespoke silk shirt. He pulled a heavy gold chain free. Hanging from the chain was a small, intricately cut platinum key. It was devoid of markings, standard issue for high-security anonymous depositories. He tore the chain from his neck. The gold links snapped. He let the key drop onto the blood-soaked marble floor. It landed with a sharp, metallic clink. "Take it," Dante whispered, his head hanging low. The blood pooled around his knees. "Take it all. You are a monster, Dom." "I am the cleaner," I said. I raised the HK, aligning the tritium front sight precisely with the occipital bone at the base of his skull. I am just sweeping the floor. I pulled the trigger. The suppressed cough of the weapon was the final, definitive punctuation mark on the reign of Dante Falcone. The subsonic round severed his spinal cord and scrambled his medulla oblongata instantly. Dante collapsed face forward onto the Carrara marble. He did not twitch. The heavy, dead weight of his body forced a final rush of air from his lungs, a long, wet sigh that faded into the hum of the air conditioning. The subterranean room fell into absolute silence. I did not look at the corpse. I crouched down, retrieving the platinum key from the pool of blood. I wiped the crimson residue off the metal using the pristine white silk handkerchief from my pocket. I slipped the key into my trousers. I stood up and turned my attention to the only other living entity in the room. Leo had not moved. He had not flinched at the two suppressed gunshots. He had not reacted to the screaming or the sudden violent death of his uncle. His savant brain filtered out the chaos of human violence, as classifying it as irrelevant acoustic noise. He was sitting exactly where he had been, staring at the blank drafting paper. The red, blue, and green crayons were still perfectly aligned. I walked over to the boy. I stepped carefully, avoiding the tracking of blood across the floor. I knelt beside him, my knee hovering an inch above the cold marble. "Leo," I said softly. He did not look at me. His pale eyes remained locked on the paper. I reached into the deep, reinforced pocket of my tailored suit. I pulled out a small, heavy velvet pouch. I opened the drawstrings and emptied the contents onto the floor, exactly 3 inches from his left hand. 12 antique wooden building blocks, hand-carved mahogany, chipped and worn, each bearing a different letter of the alphabet. Leo's breathing hitched. The rhythmic, shallow intake of air stalled in his chest. His eyes snapped from the paper to the blocks. I did not let him arrange them. I knew the specific spatial prompt required to trigger the Vanguard cryptographic seed. I had watched Aldo Falcone drill this sequence into the boy's mind for years. I moved the blocks with rapid, precise movements. I arranged them into a complex, interlocking geometric shape. A 3-dimensional pyramid, with the letters forming an anagram of the Falcone family motto across the base. Leo stared at the pyramid. His pupils dilated. The complex mathematical architecture of his brain engaged, processing the spatial relationship of the letters, converting the geometry into a sequence of prime variables. He reached out with his small, pale hand. He picked up the blue crayon. He did not hesitate. He did not hum. He pressed the blue wax against the heavy drafting paper and began to write, columns and rows. A massive, complex equation that cascaded across the white space. He wrote with terrifying speed, his hand a blur of motion, translating the invisible algorithm into physical reality. I watched the numbers form. It was a dynamic hash, a sequence that would override the highest tier of biometric security the Vanguard Trust possessed. He finished the equation. He drew a sharp, definitive line beneath the final integer, and then, at the very bottom of the page, he wrote the output. A 16-digit alphanumeric code. I stared at the sequence, committing it to memory instantly. The alphanumeric string was burned into my retinas. 5, Alpha, 9, Charlie, 7, Zulu, 2, 1, 8, Delta, 4, 4, 9, X-ray, 0, 3. I stood up. I looked at the heavy platinum key in my pocket. I had the code. I had the physical key. Dante's corpse provided the retinal access. The $60 million sitting in Vanguard box, Tam Tam Reborn, was entirely unguarded. I looked at the heavy Rolex Daytona on my left wrist. The sweeping second hand moved with relentless precision. Mikhail Rostova had given us 120 minutes. 40 minutes had already evaporated in the bunker. I had 80 minutes to extract Dante's eye, travel to LaSalle Street, bypass the Vanguard security grid, load $60 million into heavy transit bags, and vanish into the night. I did not intend to deliver the money to Pierreborn. I did not intend to buy my life from the Russian syndicate. I intended to use the $60 million to purchase the loyalty of the three most powerful rival factions in the Chicago underworld. I would fund a street war that would annihilate Mikhail Rostova's entire logistics network by dawn. I reached into my pocket, my fingers wrapping around the cold steel handle of a sterilized surgical scalpel. I walked toward Dante's lifeless body, lying in the expanding pool of dark blood on the Carrara marble. The board was clean. The pieces were mine. The surgical steel of the scalpel caught the harsh halogen light, gleaming with a sterile, unforgiving brilliance. I knelt beside the expanding pool of arterial blood. Dante's face was pressed against the Carrara marble, his jaw slack, his left eye staring vacantly at the baseboards. The smell of his voided bowels and rapidly cooling blood was a heavy, suffocating blanket in the chilled 62-degree air. I did not hesitate. In this profession, hesitation is a fatal cognitive lag. I placed the heel of my left hand firmly against Dante's forehead, anchoring his skull against the stone. With my right hand, I brought the scalpel down. The blade sliced cleanly through the thin, delicate skin of the upper eyelid. The tactile feedback vibrating through the stainless steel handle was grotesque as soft, yielding resistance followed by the wet parting of tissue. I worked with absolute, mechanical efficiency, completely detaching my mind from the biological horror of the act. I was a mechanic removing a localized component from a decommissioned machine. I severed the lateral rectus muscle. The blood pooling in the ocular cavity was dark and sluggish, devoid of arterial pressure. I reached into the pocket of my suit, retrieving a sterilized glass vial pre-filled with medical-grade saline solution. With a final, precise flick of the wrist, the scalpel severed the thick, fibrous stalk of the optic nerve. The sound was a dull, wet pop that echoed faintly against the titanium wall of the empty Mosler vault. I extracted the ocular globe, perfectly intact, and dropped it into the glass vial. The saline instantly turned a cloudy, pale pink. I sealed the rubber stopper tight. I stood up, wiping the bloody scalpel on the immaculate silk lining of Dante's ruined suit jacket before leaving it on his chest. I slipped the vial into my inner breast pocket. The cold glass pressed against my ribs, a macabre counterweight to the heckler, Koch on the opposite side. I turned my attention back to the center of the room. Leo was sitting exactly where I had left him. He had not looked up at the sound of the scalpel. He was meticulously returning his crayons to their designated slots in a small wooden box. The red, the blue, the green, perfectly aligned. "Stand up, Leo," I said. My voice was a flat, baritone frequency, projecting calm authority. The boy did not respond to the verbal command. I walked over, my leather sole stepping carefully around the blood, and placed my hand gently on his small, rigid shoulder. The physical contact broke his loop. He stood up, his face an unreadable mask of pale porcelain, his eyes staring through me into an invisible dimension of fractal geometry. I grabbed the heavy drafting paper from the floor, folding it precisely in half, and shoved it into my pocket next to the platinum key. We walked to the heavy steel elevator doors. I pressed the call button. The mechanical grinding of the gears overhead was deafening in the silence of the tomb we were leaving behind. The doors slid open. I guided the boy inside and pressed the button for the subterranean parking garage. The ascent was a slow, agonizing crawl. The digital floor indicator ticked upward, counting down the seconds of my rapidly evaporating operational window. 72 minutes remaining until Mikhail Rostova's transit window closed. 72 minutes until the Russian syndicate began a systematic purge of the Falcone family's legitimate holdings. The elevator chimed softly. The doors opened to the dim, sodium vapor glow of the executive garage. The air here smelled of damp concrete, exhaust fumes, and freezing rain leaking through the ventilation grates. I bypassed the row of armored Mercedes and Range Rovers. Those vehicles were tracked. They were heavily armored coffins waiting for a Spetsnaz ambush. I walked to a dark corner behind a massive concrete support pillar. A Hangin-le Muichin Audi Atam sat in the shadows. It was a ghost car, unregistered, untraceable, maintained strictly for catastrophic exfiltration protocols. I unlocked the doors with a cloned transponder key. I opened the rear passenger door for Leo. The boy climbed inside, sitting perfectly straight on the black leather, his hands folded neatly in his lap. He stared blankly at the back of the headrest. I slid into the driver's seat. The FTARM engine purred to life with a low, menacing growl, entirely muffled by the acoustic dampening of the cabin. I did not turn on the headlights. I navigated the underground labyrinth, using only the ambient emergency lighting, driving up the steep, spiraling concrete ramp toward the surface. The heavy steel roll-up door engaged as I approached, grinding upward to reveal the brutal reality of the Chicago night. I drove out into the freezing deluge. The rain battered the windshield, a relentless drumbeat of ice and water. The city was a sprawling, indifferent monolith of dark glass and wet asphalt, reflecting the distorted yellow bleeding of the streetlights. I turned onto Lower Wacker Drive. The subterranean artery of the city was mostly deserted at this hour, a concrete tunnel bathed in sickly orange light. It was the exact stretch of road where Aldo Falcone had allegedly burned to death 6 months ago. The irony tasted like old copper in the back of my throat, but I forced the cognitive distraction away. Logic dictates survival. I pushed the Audi to 70 miles per hour, weaving seamlessly through the concrete pillars. The heavy tires gripped the damp pavement with flawless precision. I constantly checked the rearview mirror, my eyes scanning the shadows for the distinct, aggressive silhouette of Russian pursuit vehicles. The road behind me remained empty. Mikhail's spotters were focused on the commercial exits of the financial district, waiting for a heavy transport convoy. They were not looking for a single, unregistered luxury sedan moving through the lower levels. I took the exit ramp for LaSalle Street. The financial heart of Chicago loomed above us, a canyon of towering, neoclassical bank facades and impenetrable glass skyscrapers. The freezing rain turned the grand architecture into a landscape of Gothic menace. Vanguard Trust occupied a massive, windowless block of polished black granite on the corner of Adams and LaSalle. It did not display a logo. It did not have a public entrance. It was a fortress designed to hold the darkest secrets of the global elite, operating with a level of discretion that rivaled foreign intelligence agencies. I pulled the Audi into a narrow, unmarked alleyway running adjacent to the granite structure. The alley was pitch black, smelling of wet dumpsters and rotting cardboard. I parked the car deep in the shadows, leaving the engine idling. The heater blasted warm air into the cabin, but the chill in my bones was permanent. "Stay," I commanded, looking at Leo through the rearview mirror. The boy did not blink. He was tracing an invisible pattern on the leather armrest with his index finger. I stepped out into the storm. The freezing rain instantly soaked my hair, running down my neck and under the collar of my suit. I pulled my heavy wool overcoat tight, concealing the bulge of the #K, and walked toward the discreet, recessed steel door at the side of the Vanguard building. The VIP subterranean entrance. There were no guards posted outside. Human guards can be bribed, intimidated, or killed. Vanguard relied entirely on automated, biometric lethality. I approached the heavy steel door. A smooth black glass panel was mounted flush against the granite wall. I reached into my pocket, my cold fingers wrapping around the glass vial. I pulled the stopper, draining the pink, blood-tinged saline onto the wet asphalt. I extracted Dante's eye, holding the cold gelatinous globe between my thumb and forefinger. I pressed the severed eye directly against the black glass panel. A high-intensity red laser instantly flared from behind the glass, sweeping across the dead cornea in a rapid, geometric grid. The machine was reading the capillary matrix, verifying the unique biological signature of Dante Falcone. The tension in my jaw tightened. If the ocular pressure had dropped too low, if the cold had constricted the capillaries beyond recognition, the system would instantly lock down and trigger a silent alarm to the Chicago Police Department. The red laser vanished. A soft, electronic chime echoed in the alley. The black glass panel glowed a steady, validating green. The heavy steel door clicked, the internal deadbolts retracting with a deep, mechanical thud. I tossed the useless eye into the storm drain. I pushed the door open and stepped into the sterile, hyper-modern vestibule of Vanguard Trust. The interior was a stark contrast to the Gothic exterior. Brilliant, shadowless LED lighting illuminated a corridor of seamless brushed steel and white marble. The air was heavily filtered, entirely devoid of moisture or scent. I walked down the corridor. There was no reception desk. There was no human interaction. At the end of the hall stood the primary vault access terminal, a massive, heavily armored console integrated directly into a solid wall of reinforced titanium. 50 minutes remaining, I stepped up to the console. A high-resolution touchscreen glowed to life, displaying a prompt for the physical key. I pulled the platinum key Dante had surrendered. I inserted it into the narrow, unmarked slot on the console. The screen shifted, demanding the 16-digit dynamic cryptographic override. The emergency access protocol. I pulled the folded drafting paper from my pocket. My hands were perfectly steady. I looked at the alphanumeric sequence Leo had generated, based on the spatial configuration of the antique wooden blocks. 5, Alpha, 9, Charlie, 7, Zulu, 2, 1. 8, Delta, 4, 4. 9, X-ray, 0, 3. I typed the sequence into the digital keypad. Each keystroke echoed with a sharp, synthetic click. I pressed the final integer, 3. I held my breath. The architecture of my plan rested entirely on this single moment of digital validation. If Aldo Falcone had changed the root algorithm, if Leo's Savant brain had dropped a fractal variable due to the sensory overload in the bunker, the titanium wall in front of me would permanently seal, trapping me in a subterranean cage. The screen flashed blue. ACCESS granted. A deep, tectonic vibration shook the marble floor beneath my wet boots. The solid wall of titanium began to separate, massive hydraulic rams pulling the seamless steel apart to reveal the inner sanctum of the Vanguard depository. The vault room was an expansive, circular chamber lined with thousands of identical flush-mounted steel drawers. In the center of the room, a heavy, automated robotic arm hung suspended from the ceiling, waiting for a retrieval command. I stepped into the chamber. The console screen updated, prompting me for the specific box number. I typed Tam Tram Muy Born, Dante's private reserve. The robotic arm whirred to life with a high-pitched, electrical whine. It glided effortlessly along the ceiling track, descending toward the far wall. It locked onto a specific steel drawer, engaged its heavy magnetic clamps, and pulled the 3-foot-long container entirely out of the wall. The arm rotated, bringing the heavy steel box to the central extraction table in front of me. It deposited the container with a soft, metallic clatter and retreated to the ceiling. 45 minutes remaining. I stood over the steel box. $60 million in uncut diamonds and untraceable bearer bonds lay just beneath the heavy lid. The absolute, unmitigated leverage required to purchase the rival syndicates and annihilate the Russian network before dawn. I reached out, grabbing the recessed latches on the side of the box. The steel was freezing. I flipped the latches. They popped with a sharp, satisfying snap. I threw the lid open. The harsh, shadowless LED lighting of the vault flooded the interior of the container. The air in my lungs turned instantly to ash. The steady, metronomic rhythm of my heart stalled, skipping a beat before slamming violently against my ribcage. The freezing chill of the rain that had soaked my clothes was completely eclipsed by the absolute, paralyzing zero radiating from the contents of the box. I did not blink. I stared into the container, my brain violently rejecting the visual data, desperately trying to recompile the architecture of reality. There were no velvet pouches filled with uncut diamonds. There were no neatly stacked bundles of bearer bonds. There was no $60 million. The heavy steel box was entirely empty, save for 3 objects resting perfectly in the center of the polished metal floor. A red wax crayon, a blue wax crayon, a green wax crayon. They were aligned in a perfect, color-coordinated row, exactly parallel to the edge of the steel box. And resting beneath the crayons was a single folded sheet of heavy drafting paper. The friction in my skull was deafening. The tectonic plates of my logic, my meticulous planning, my flawless execution, ground together and shattered into a million jagged fragments. Dante Falcone was a coward, but he was a predictable coward. He would never lie about his exit fund while staring down the barrel of a suppressed weapon. He believed the 60 million was in this box. I reached into the container with a hand that was suddenly trembling. A microscopic, involuntary vibration in my fingers. I picked up the folded drafting paper. The texture of the paper was identical to the sheets I had provided Leo in the bunker. I unfolded it. Drawn in thick, jagged lines of red, blue, and green wax was a perfectly scaled, architectural rendering of the very Vanguard vault room I was currently standing in. But the drawing did not focus on the robotic arm or the steel drawers. It focused on the heavy titanium doors at the entrance. The drawing depicted the massive hydraulic rams fully extended, sealing the circular chamber shut, and in the center of the drawing, drawn in heavy, frantic red wax, was a single eye, weeping a pool of blood. The timestamp written in blue crayon at the bottom right corner of the paper was not from yesterday, it was not from a week ago, it was time-stamped exactly 6 months ago, the day of the car bomb on Lower Wacker Drive. The false trail completely inverted, crushing the last remaining oxygen from my lungs. The chin fan trum of the truth was laid bare in absolute, terrifying clarity. Aldo Falcone did not just empty the Mosler vault in the bunker tonight to frame Dante. Aldo Falcone had emptied Dante's secret Vanguard box 6 months ago, replacing the wealth with this drawing, knowing with absolute, terrifying certainty that this exact sequence of events would unfold. Aldo knew Dante would eventually betray him. Aldo knew I would manipulate Dante into opening the Vanguard Trust to save his own life, but the mote van Trum. The missing link that shredded the final shred of my sanity. How could Aldo Falcone leave a drawing, rendered in Leo's distinct Savant style, inside a sealed biometric vault 6 months ago? Leo had been locked in the penthouse under armed guard. Leo had not visited Vanguard. Unless Leo was not just processing the algorithms. Unless Leo was the one who designed them. The heavy, mechanical grinding of titanium against titanium echoed violently through the circular chamber. I spun around, dropping the drafting paper. The massive hydraulic rams of the vault entrance were engaging. The seamless titanium walls were closing, sliding together with the unstoppable, crushing force of a tectonic shift. I lunged toward the exit, my leather boots slipping on the polished marble. I threw my weight forward, desperately reaching for the narrowing gap. I was 10 feet away when the massive titanium slabs slammed together. The pneumatic seals hissed, locking with a final, deafening boom that shook the foundation of the building. The vault was permanently sealed. I crashed against the cold, unyielding titanium, my hands frantically slapping the smooth metal. There was no keypad on the inside. There was no manual override handle. It was an impenetrable tomb designed to suffocate anyone trapped within its walls. I turned back to face the center of the room. The robotic arm hung motionless from the ceiling. The empty steel box sat on the extraction table, mocking me with the 3 perfectly aligned wax crayons. The ambient LED lighting suddenly flickered. A harsh, electric buzz vibrated through the floorboards. The lights snapped off, plunging the subterranean vault into absolute, pitch-black darkness. The silence that followed was heavy, oppressive, and utterly devoid of hope. I was buried alive beneath LaSalle Street, locked in a cage built by a ghost, with no wealth, no leverage, and no exit. And then, from the absolute blackness near the ceiling, a sudden, sharp sound pierced the silence. The high-pitched, synthetic chirp of an internal intercom speaker engaging. A voice echoed through the dark chamber. It was not the deep, paranoid gravel of Aldo Falcone. It was the high, thin, perfectly calm voice of a 5-year-old boy. The sequence is complete, Dominic. The absolute absence of light has a physical weight. It is a crushing, barometric pressure that immediately strips away spatial awareness, leaving only the raw, exposed nerve endings of the human body. I did not move. I stood perfectly still in the center of the Vanguard vault, the heavy steel container resting on the extraction table inches from my waist. The freezing ambient temperature of the subterranean chamber began to leach the kinetic heat from my tailored suit. I traced the rim of the steel box in the pitch blackness. My fingertips brushed the smooth, cold wax of the red crayon. The high-pitched, synthetic chirp of the intercom speaker cracked again. The static hissed, smelling faintly of heated copper wire and stale electricity. "The sequence is complete, Dominic." The voice was thin. It was high. It lacked the gravel, the whiskey, and the scarred vocal cords that traditionally commanded the Chicago underworld. It was the voice of a 5-year-old child, but the cadence, the precise, unhurried articulation of the syllables belonged to a sociopathic apex predator. I did not shout. I did not draw the heckler, cock USP, and fire blindly into the titanium ceiling. Panic is a biological flaw. It accelerates the heart rate. It burns oxygen. "Leo," I said. My voice was a flat, baritone vibration, entirely stripped of resonance by the acoustic dampening of the circular vault. "You are in the Audi. You are in the Audi. The ghost car is equipped with a localized satellite uplink. Aldo installed it for emergency offshore routing." The child's voice drifted down from the darkness, completely devoid of adrenaline or fear. "I am currently overriding the Vanguard internal network from the rear passenger seat. The climate control in the vehicle is quite efficient." The syntax was terrifying. A boy who had not spoken 3 consecutive words aloud in 6 months was articulating high-level cryptographic espionage with the clinical detachment of a machine. "Box 814, I said, my thumb rubbing the wax of the crayon. "Dante's Reserve." "You emptied it." "A spatial redirect, Dominic," Leo corrected. The static popped softly. "The 16-digit sequence you entered did not just bypass the biometric security. It executed a dynamic recalibration of the robotic armature's internal mapping. You did not extract Dante's Reserve. You extracted the box I prepared 6 months ago, box 000. The tectonic plates of the false trail dissolved entirely, leaving a smooth, frictionless surface of absolute horror. The architecture of the betrayal was not a crude manipulation of a greedy uncle. It was a masterpiece of multi-generational slaughter. "You prepared it," I whispered. The air in the vault was already beginning to taste flat, the oxygen cyclers winding down. "Aldo brought you here." Aldo was a blunt instrument who recognized the value of a quantum processor. He did not teach me the algorithms, Dominic. I derived them. I mapped the prime variables of his financial networks before my 4th birthday. Leo paused. A steady, even breath hissed over the open microphone. "He brought me to this vault to generate the master seed. But a processor is only valuable until the code is compiled." Aldo understood that my intellectual capacity was expanding exponentially. I was no longer a tool. I was a liability. He was planning to dismantle the processor once the offshore network was fully automated. Aldo Falcone was going to execute his own 5-year-old son. "So you killed him," I stated. "I routed $3.2 million through a dark web proxy using a randomized fractional skimming algorithm over 4 weeks, Leo explained. "The mathematics of patricide, delivered without a single tremor of emotion. I contracted an independent demolitions expert in Brighton Beach. I accessed the GPS navigation unit in Aldo's armored car. I calculated the exact velocity and trajectory required to detonate the charge under the structural pillars of Lower Wacker Drive. It was basic spatial geometry. Basic geometry. The car bomb. The dental records fused to the steering column. Aldo did not fake his death to steal the family wealth. Aldo was incinerated by the monster he created. And Dante? I asked, turning my head toward the unseen titanium door. The heavy metal was an impenetrable barrier between me and the surface of the earth. Dante was a chaotic variable. He created noise. He disrupted the equilibrium of the cash flow with his paranoia. I needed the board reset. I needed a cleaner. Me. You are the most efficient algorithm in the Falcone family, Dominic, the boy said. You identify anomalies and you erase them. I left the scorched building block in the Mosler vault. I drew the ventilation schematic. I provided the breadcrumbs. I knew your processing speed would lead you to Dante's guilt. I knew you would force Dante to surrender the Vanguard access. A cleaner sweeps the board perfectly, but someone has to put the broom away. The cold was absolute now. It permeated the marrow of my bones. I was not a player. I was not the master strategist of the Chicago underworld. I was a piece of automated code written by a 5-year-old child, executing a command sequence I did not even comprehend. "The 50 million, I said. "In the bunker, transferred digitally to a decentralized, encrypted ledger 90 seconds before you opened the Mosler door," Leo replied. "The physical space was empty because the wealth no longer exists in a physical state. Paper is obsolete, Dominic. Mikhail Rostova is waiting at Pier 4. He will tear the city apart to find you. Mikhail Rostova does not want 50 million in physical currency. He wants the encryption keys to a frictionless global logistics network. I transferred ownership of the network to his syndicate 10 minutes ago." The sound of a heavy, distant engine revving filtered through the intercom. The Audi's VTAM. "Mikhail's spotters are not hunting me, Dominic," Leo said. "They are currently escorting the Audi to a private airstrip in Gary. I have purchased their protection." A heavy, definitive metallic clank echoed deep within the titanium walls. The sound of the external primary deadbolts engaging, the final permanent seal on the vault. "The ventilation system in Vault 0 is shutting down," Leo stated. The chilling, synthetic calm in his voice was the most horrifying sound I have ever processed. "You have approximately 4 hours of breathable oxygen. Your heart rate is currently elevated. If you reduce your metabolic output, you may extend the window to 5. I pulled the heavy Heckler, Koch USP from my shoulder holster. The customized steel weapon felt utterly useless in the dark. Primitive club wielded against a digital god. "Why the crayons, Leo?" I asked. The question was a final, morbid curiosity echoing in the tomb. "Why leave the drawing in the box?" A pause. A microscopic crackle of static over the intercom. "Because Aldo taught me that every architect must sign his work," the 5-year-old boy whispered. "You were a very good cleaner, Dominic, but you only swept the floors. You never looked at the ceiling." The intercom clicked. A sharp, electrical snap. The absolute silence rushed back into the vault, heavier, denser, and infinitely more profound than before. The darkness was a solid mass pressing against my retinas, suffocating my optical nerves. I stood in the center of the circular room. The air was already beginning to taste stale, a faint metallic tang settling on the back of my tongue. I slid the Heckler, Koch, back into the leather holster. I did not strike the titanium walls. I did not scream into the void. Panic accelerates oxygen consumption. Panic is a failure of logic. I reached into the inner breast pocket of my suit and pulled out the glass vial containing Dante's severed eye. I dropped it onto the polished marble floor. The glass shattered with a sharp, crisp sound that fractured the silence. The saline solution and the dead organic tissue splashed against the toe of my leather boot. I lowered myself slowly onto the freezing floor. I sat cross-legged in the pitch black. I reached out and touched the heavy steel box on the extraction table. My fingers brushed the smooth, unbroken wax of the 3 crayons resting inside. The underworld is a machine. It does not run on loyalty or fear or blood. It runs on mathematics. It runs on the cold, unforgiving calculation of leverage and variables. For 20 years, I believed I was the mathematician. I believed I understood the absolute geometry of violence. I closed my eyes in the dark. I slowed my breathing. In, out. A steady, metronomic rhythm, matching the fading pulse of the dying air. I have 4 hours to appreciate the flawless, horrifying perfection of the equation that erased me.